When I got to Saudi Arabia, it's as if, especially with a woman, a Western woman, someone just pulls the rug out from underneath you, and the world is topsy-turvy. Nothing makes sense anymore. They were playing the Americans.
So September 11th wasn't a surprise to you?
It was never a surprise to me.
She was a stay-at-home mom whose husband's job took them around the world. She had lived in Asia and Europe, but nothing quite prepared her for the news that they would be moving to Saudi Arabia. She soon found herself right in the middle of international politics and events. Her years there gave her a new perspective on America's foreign policy and our dependence on foreign oil and terrorism. Today, Patricia Clark Taylor is here. She's author of Unveilings. Great to have you here today,
thanks.
Patricia.
That's great.
So I love to travel, and I think you were living, for me, the ideal life. You were with your husband and son in Italy.
That's right.
Outside of Florence, I think?
Yes, we actually lived at Marina di Pisa, which was on the ocean, and it was a wonderful place because I could hop on the train and I could be in Florence in almost no time. So we had an opportunity to travel throughout Europe, and it was great because it set a background for me of ancient history and then early modern history as well.
And how long were you there?
3 years.
3 years. But then you got the news.
Actually, I got the news the night I arrived in Italy.
Oh, really?
Yes. We went to a dinner at the Officers Club, and I was prepared for this wonderful time in Italy. And the talk that night was entirely of Saudi Arabia. I was not prepared for that. And when we came home that evening, I said to my husband, look, I'm willing to go a lot of places, but I don't know about Saudi Arabia, because already I could see the antenna was up. That's how it was with these guys. Then it was guys. It was not women who were engineers, much different today. But, and I thought, oh no, Saudi Arabia is on the horizon. So what happened is that we had the first oil embargo in 1973, and we were living in Italy, and we couldn't get oil. It was cold outside. There was snow on the ground. So my husband said, well, we can always go to Saudi Arabia. Actually, what was happening is that the Saudis were building their coffers. It was the first time they were shaking their sabers, and they were building their coffers. And later on, that would provide the money to rebuild Saudi Arabia. And that's what happened. By 1976, we had become a part of this whole Saudi Arabia buildup.
So you weren't crazy about going to Saudi Arabia, but you ended up, but you went along with it?
Yeah, actually what happened is part of the office in Livorno, Italy, went to Virginia, and part of the office went to Saudi Arabia, but it was all part of the Saudi program. And because we had, one of our sons was learning disabled, Al, and we had selected a private school for him in the States, which was wonderful. It was also very expensive. So it worked for us to stay out of the country and to go to Saudi. And I just went bravely. We'll see what this brings. So, and already I was working for Revlon by that time, and working part-time for Revlon, and they had suggested that I take their products in, which were banned actually because it was considered a Jewish company, but that I take it in through the military, under the military umbrella for the exchanges there. So I gave it some consideration. I said I would see. So later on, when I went to Saudi Arabia, I actually became the Revlon lady.
The first Revlon associate in
I think
Saudi
I was
Arabia.
the last.
And I read about some of the logistical problems you had bringing stuff in.
Yeah.
But so what was your first impression when you got there?
Nothing prepared me for it. By this time, I considered myself a world traveler, but there was nothing.
Because you had lived in Japan.
Yeah, yeah, wonderful people. I mean, everywhere we met, there was wonderful people, including the Middle East. But when I got to Saudi Arabia, it's as if, especially with a woman, a Western woman, someone just pulls the rug out from underneath you, and the world is topsy-turvy. Nothing makes sense anymore. So it was trying to adjust to a country that is hostile in many ways, but certainly hostile to women. And then, like, okay, now what do I do? And how do I make this life here? How does it work for me and my children? My husband was whisked off to work immediately. He was working the whole time, so then it was a matter. So
you were at home in the compound, or initially?
Yeah, we moved into a 4-family compound, no telephone, no way to communicate, actually. And there were 3 other families that eventually moved in. there were no roads to our compound. The compound had like a 9 or 10-foot wall, and it was through the bumpy desert. And right across from me was a mosque. It was the first thing that was built in this region that would be eventually built up. And so there I was. And so it was, how do we make this work?
So how did you make it work?
We were very fortunate in that the other families that moved in, who also were working with my husband, they were engineers essentially and doing the same things, and the wives were very bright, very smart, and trying to also decide how they would make their way. We decided that we would become, one of the things we would do is become the party compound, which we did. And we had great parties while we were there and met a lot of people that way. But also, the women, one by one, began to step out of the compound and to familiarize ourselves with our surroundings. And we became much more brave about everything.
So did you have to wear the veil? And what was your daily, what did you do when you were outside the compound?
We actually arrived in 1976, and the Middle East was much freer than it is today because Islamic fundamentalism had not yet hit. By the time we left in 1979, Islamic fundamentalism had come into Iran, and we could see that it was going to be a change for the women throughout the Middle East who had begun in a Western direction in their dress and, I guess, maybe their thinking. And they were just bashed with this Islamic fundamentalism, which threw them back in time, put them all under the veil. In Saudi, the women were generally always under the veil, but at least in the coastal areas, throughout the Middle East, that was not true. Women were not always under the veil, and in the coastal areas of Saudi Arabia, the women were freer. The teenagers, but in Riyadh, yeah, that's where the royal family is, and that was where it was like this.
And you said that there were the religious police, or at least there were stories of the religious police going around and spray painting the women's ankles or legs if they had.
Yes, they would have. They had red spray paint, and they would paint the women's legs. This was even before Islamic fundamentalism, so we did have to be careful. I usually wore a long skirt to the marketplace, but sometimes I wore short sleeves with, short sleeves, like the cover on the book. And we were treated pretty well, actually. We came under the military umbrella, so we were treated better than some of the British or other people there who worked directly for the Saudis. Yeah, they took the harshest
So despite your military background, I guess I should say reading this book, and I wasn't sure, but you describe yourself as a Southern Christian. Yeah. But I guess I would call you the religious left. You're not exactly the religious right. Is that right?
I always was, and I never understood when it turned right. It just was like not right for me for it to turn right. But yeah, even as a teenager in Florida, I worked with Governor Leroy Collins, who was an extremely progressive governor. And we worked on issues, of course, of school integration, and which I thought I couldn't understand. I never understood why it was segregated. I mean, I knew, but I didn't know. It was like, why is this that we should be segregated? We need to know one another, and how will we ever know one another if we're segregated all the time? And sometimes I think about that now with the Middle East. We're just so segregated from one another, which is very sad.
But again, you went into this from I mean, you're not a post 9/11 religious conservative.
No. Yeah.
And there wasn't the fundamentalism. But still, though, your impression of Saudi Arabia did not seem very favorable in the book.
Yeah, it was. There was a harshness about the people and about the land. And of course, my husband was with the military, the U.S. military, who was working for the royal family. And we just never interacted with them. I mean, talk about segregation. They had nothing to do with us. We were the worker bees that had come there. We were well paid, but we were the worker bees that came there to build their city, to build up their military, and to do all of these good things for them. That was it. And then we were to go home, and just that was it. But the Saudis never changed about anything. They never embraced anything about us, and certainly never freed their women. So, yeah, and if we wanted to practice our Christian religion, it went underground. And so there was no, I mean, they come here, I know, and want to be free, but we had none. We had no religious freedom. So
we'll be right back with Patricia Clark, author of Unveilings. And we are back with Patricia Clark Taylor today, talking about her book Unveilings and her life in Saudi Arabia. So I like your quote. At one point you said in the book that, in your opinion, Saudi Arabia was, you saw opulence, cruelty, and crudeness packaged together in a rather tacky package.
True.
What's your quote?
That's it. When we got there, of course, Saudi was still very much looked like a city in the desert, just a desert city, actually, a desert town. And because we were there actually to change the face of it.
So you felt that they were playing Americans?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what they were doing. They were playing the Americans. We were there and we were making money, and that was great, but actually we were always under their control. It was always all about their rules. And for instance, if I wanted to practice Christianity, it was hidden. It absolutely was hidden. We could go to worship services, but they were behind walls, and nobody could ever know about it. And so that's just how it was. We accepted that. But Saudi never gave back, other than monetarily. In other words, I never saw that there was a situation where they were working closely with the U.S. to maybe bring about some changes, humanitarian changes, humanitarian rights changes, anything like that, schooling for women. I met women who were literally slaves in Saudi Arabia, and they would not be able to change it. I met a young woman, actually, when I was flying, when I was working with Revlon. I was flying throughout the country, and she had been raised in England and now had come back to Saudi Arabia. Her father was in Saudi, and he was a very high-ranking Saudi. And she had to return to the country to inherit, for her inheritance. And if she did not do that, she would be killed by her brothers. Wow. She would have to marry who she was told.
That in the news these days.
Absolutely, it goes on and on. So what has ever really changed?
But it's interesting, sometimes in America I think there's a tendency to think of the Middle East or Muslims all as one group, but living there you were very aware of the fact that well, you said the Saudis were afraid of the Iraqis.
Yes.
There was some fear, but in the Egyptians, I mean, what were some of the internal dynamics with some of the different
There were
groups
people who came from various places to work in Saudi Arabia because it took a very large workforce to do what was required for building up the country. A lot of the people there were Egyptians, and we met and worked with Egyptians who had come from Egypt, and they were just absolutely delightful. And they were as surprised, I found that they were as surprised at the harshness of the culture in Saudi Arabia as we were. And I actually went home with one of my Egyptian friends, and her father was one of Sadat's top generals. And it was wonderful because I met their family, I met so many wonderful people. And for them, I was the first American they'd ever met. So they
they treated you like a celebrity.
Yeah,
they
really did. Yeah, and it was a wonderful time because Sadat had just gone to Jerusalem with peace overtures and wanting peace, and so they were very excited about that and wanted to know what I thought about it and so forth. And I found them to be delightful people. And
they also wanted to hear about what it was like living in Saudi Arabia, because they were also kind of shocked about.
Exactly. And I could tell that Nahed, my friend, her parents were very worried about her living there because they knew that it was such a harsh culture for women. So that was an eye-opener for me, that the Muslim people throughout the Middle East were different. Not everybody was exactly the same, and they all didn't live under this harsh culture. But then in 1979, I saw Islamic fundamentalism come into Iran, and with that, much of the Middle East began to change, much of the world began to change.
Now, you went back to the Middle East at one point and ended up living in Israel.
Yes. My husband actually was called to build the peacekeeping camps in the Sinai, and this came out of the peace talks with Carter at the time during the Carter administration.
After the war between Egypt and Israel.
And Israel, that's right. And after Sadat had gone to Jerusalem as well. So, and there was a peace, actually, that was formed out of those talks, and that Israeli-Egyptian peace is still today. When we arrived in Israel, we had only been there 3 days and President Sadat was assassinated. So we didn't know if we'd be going back home. We didn't know what would happen. And my heart went out to the Israeli people who had put their hopes in Sadat, and to the Egyptian people as well who wanted peace. Fortunately, Vice President Hosni Mubarak stepped forward and stepped up to the plate, and he held that peace in place. So, and that has been a great thing for Israel. Before, Israel had to fight wars on 3 different fronts. But with peace with Egypt, it made a huge difference for Israel.
It's interesting, so that the Saudis were not happy about.
No, the Saudis were not happy. As a matter of fact, they would, some of the Saudi men would beat up Egyptian men in Saudi Arabia. They were very unhappy about that. And I'm sure they were already sponsoring all kinds of underground terrorist organizations, no doubt in my mind. Now, let me say this. I don't think that all Saudis are that way, perhaps. but I think for a long time they have been using petrodollars to benefit their causes.
So September 11th wasn't a surprise to you?
It was never a surprise to me. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't know how they got through the CIA. I don't know how it should have happened. But the fact that there were people planning to do this from the Middle East, and most of them were Saudis, it never surprised me. What did surprise me is that for 6 months after that, you couldn't see the name Saudi Arabia or hear Saudi Arabia mentioned in the news. It was like shut down. This is all right. This is not Saudi Arabia. This is, Saudis are good people. They're great. It was just shut down. So we heard about.
Yeah, because on the one hand, I think after September 11th, there was people didn't want to, you know, the way during World War II with the Japanese, let's say, where they were putting concentration camps, a lot of people went out of their way to say, okay, we're not going to bash Muslims in the U.S.,
right.
even though, you know, obviously there was.
Exactly.
You know, but so do you think it was, I mean, it wasn't just that the people were trying to be politically correct, if you will, and not bash the Saudis, but you think that they actually were, it was more than that?
Yeah, I think it was more than that. I think we still thought of the Saudis as our friends because we had had an alliance with them since the 50s for oil. And how terrible to think that they should turn out to be not so friendly, that this could actually happen. Now, we'd never blame the Saudi royal family or even the bin Laden family, but nevertheless, this came out of Saudi Arabia, out of a child of Saudi Arabia, and Saudi was never held responsible at all. And I think it's because of oil, because we just have to be so careful. We have to tread lightly when it comes to the Saudis.
Therein lies another thread in your book, which is America's dependence on foreign oil. So what is your reaction to, especially these days with the price of gas going up all the time, you've actually come up with your own ideas for legislation for how you would change the situation?
Exactly. I don't understand the American psyche when it comes to the fact that we have never created a viable alternative fuels industry. I mean, I think we should have gone to solar like a long time ago. I haven't been able to figure out if it's a bias against science. I just don't really know what it is. Maybe it is the oil companies that have kept this from happening. I don't know. But I know that we've never done it. And President Carter was, I think, the last president to step forward and say, we must do that. We must do this. And I was working on the Hill when he recruited people to Washington who would form, it was an academic group, but they would form an alternative energies group, and we would head into that direction. When President Reagan came into power, as far as I know, that was dismantled. And we just went right back to business as usual with the Saudis. So I know that people have many different opinions. I know that I don't know everything, but I have always been shocked that we have not gone to alternative fuels. There's no excuse.
We'll be right back with Patricia Clark Taylor, author of Unveilings. And we are back with Patricia Clark Taylor today talking about her book, Unveilings. Well, and as you said before the break, you actually did end up in Capitol Hill when you lived there for periods. So how did you get to Capitol Hill and what did you do there?
When I came back from Israel, I completed my education at the University of Maryland and later received a master's degree from Duke University. I was studying politics and international politics and with a focus on the Middle East. Actually, when we were in Israel, I studied studied for a year at Tel Aviv University. So when I came to the Hill...
I was impressed. You were always studying, it seemed, wherever you
Yeah,
could.
I was so interested in everything. I mean, I was. So when I came to Capitol Hill in 1984, I went to work for a member of Congress, Charles Bennett, from Jacksonville, Florida. And I just was amazed that people on the Hill didn't know more about Saudi Arabia, about petroleum, about the Middle East, actually. But it seemed there was always an interest in Israel and in keeping the peace, I believe. But somehow this never got around to being in any way related to petroleum or to energy. And actually, it was all part of one big package. It always went together.
Do you think that's changing today?
Well, with the price of oil going up, I think we will have to go to alternative fuels.
At least the car companies seem to be doing
Yeah,
something
exactly.
about it.
I mean, we lost the automobile industry in the 1970s when Toyota came in with fuel-efficient cars, and with cars that were designed to be fuel efficient. And Detroit never went in that direction. They just didn't for a long time.
You said at one point in the book that, again, you lived so many places around the world, and that's a whole other story in itself,
Yeah.
but you've just been everywhere: Africa, Asia, Europe, Middle East, America. And you are Southern Christian with a bit of Jewish influence as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And studied Islam. You said at some point you felt like you didn't really fit in anywhere, because you live in Florida now, but you're not exactly a typical Floridian,
Exactly.
having traveled the world and studied Islam and everything else.
Right.
But yet when you were in the Middle East, you're not from the Middle East, and
It's
you
true.
are American, but what did you gain out of that? I mean, from the religious point, I mean, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Islam, where did you...
I changed. In other words, my view of the world, of religion, everything became much larger, so that it would encompass all peoples of the world. Actually, maybe that's where I always was and just didn't realize it. But when I came back, I didn't have this driving notion that it's just really all about Christianity. And because I had just really fallen in love with other people from around the world, and they were from all kinds of backgrounds, different backgrounds. And so we are a world community, and we have different worldviews, we have different thoughts, we have different ways of living, we have different lifestyles, but the one thing we must do is learn how to get along together. And that's one of the sad things right now.
Do you think that is possible?
I think it's possible. I think it's possible. I'm not sure how we get past the politics, but there must be a way, because right now we are at odds with the Middle East, with many places in the Middle East, and yet there's so many wonderful people in all of those places. And the result is we don't get to know each other. We don't get to learn from each other. We don't get to have these experiences with one another. I was fortunate because I had these experiences. I met these people. And I just am sad that, at least temporarily, the walls seem to be up, and we seem to be closed off from much of the world.
You mentioned toward the book, going back to September 11th a minute, that the compound that you lived in initially when you got to Saudi Arabia, you believe had experienced a terrorist attack.
Oh, right. Yeah. Actually, we were in a small compound when we first arrived, and then we moved into a 100-unit compound, which had a swimming pool and a clubhouse, and it was a lot more fun, tennis courts and all that. But the idea is that it would be temporarily for the Army Corps of Engineers, which the group that built it, and later on it would be for the Saudis. And it was in Wadi Hanifa, and the compound was known as B2. Later on, as I was writing the book, actually, a few years ago, I saw on the internet that I believe it was that compound, was blown up by Saudi groups that were against men and women mixing and so on and so forth. A lot of the international community lived there, as well as some Saudis, and they mixed together.
Well, thank you very much. Patricia Clark Taylor, the book is Unveiling, just a fascinating journey.
Thank
you
you
very much for being here today. Thanks, everybody, for watching. We'll see you next time.